Intimate labor operates under a massive global paradox. Across almost every era and geography, commercialized sex is integrated into the local political economy, generating vast amounts of wealth. Yet the laborers producing that wealth are systematically pushed into the lowest, most dangerous tiers of legal and social standing. People often dismiss this by calling prostitution the world's oldest profession. That phrase is analytically lazy. It implies that commercial sex is a static, biological inevitability. The historical record shows the exact opposite. The regulation of commercial sex is an exercise in biopolitics. States and empires do not regulate intimacy purely out of moral concern. They regulate it to serve their immediate macroeconomic and structural needs. Those needs are constantly mutating. In the ancient Near East, intimate labor was integrated into sacred civic infrastructure. Later, classical empires used it as a major engine for municipal tax revenue. By the modern era, colonial powers weaponized it to maintain imperial military dominance. Tracing this history from the sacred rites of ancient Mesopotamia to the algorithmic gig economy of the 21st century exposes a highly deliberate architecture of capital extraction. We are looking at a continuous restructuring by states and markets to commodify human intimacy, while strictly enforcing who holds power and who remains vulnerable. The earliest recorded institutionalization of intimate labor appears in ancient Sumer around 2400 BCE. In the city of Uruk, temple brothels known as the Kakum were dedicated to the fertility goddess Inanna. Here, sexual exchange was structurally woven into the local cosmology, treated as a necessary ritual to ensure agricultural yields and demographic growth. Compare that cosmological model to classical antiquity, where the focus shifted strictly to bureaucratic pragmatism. The Athenian lawmaker Solon established state-supported brothels to manage the demands of unmarried maritime merchants. Simultaneously, the state heavily taxed these lower-tier workers to fund public infrastructure. The Roman Empire inherited this Greek model of taxation and regulation, but hardened the social boundaries. From the 30s CE onward, prostitution was legal, widespread, and heavily taxed, but the Roman state applied much harsher punitive categorizations to the workers themselves. Rome legally classified prostitutes as infames. This specific designation actively stripped workers of their social standing and access to standard legal protections, even though they were operating entirely within the law. Classical antiquity established a blueprint that modern systems still utilize. The state relies on intimate labor for municipal funding and public order, while explicitly degrading the legal and social humanity of the laborers providing it. By the 19th and 20th centuries, European colonialism scaled this biopolitical control globally. Imperial administrations utilized the regulation of sexuality as a primary strategy for conquest and subjugation. Prior to British intervention in the Indian subcontinent, the Tawaifs operated as an elite class of highly educated courtesans. They held substantial wealth, owned land, and gathered vital political intelligence while navigating the highest echelons of Mughal society and regional royalty. The British colonial administration dismantled this influence systematically. They stripped the Tawaifs of their property and prestige, forcibly relocating them to military cantonments to exclusively service British soldiers. The colonial state codified this degradation by engineering the archetype of the morally depraved third world prostitute. This manufactured narrative provided the legal and moral cover to justify paternalistic imperial intervention over local populations. In North America, colonizers applied this same logic of conquest through sexual violence. Recognizing that women were essential for tribal continuity, military forces routinely forced Native women into the sex trade as a deliberate strategy to shatter indigenous communities and seize control over their land. These engineered cycles of displacement and generational trauma directly produced modern statistical crises. Today, Native American women comprise less than 10% of local populations in studied regions, yet they represent up to 40% of sex trafficking survivors. Imperial administrations built these exploitative markets from the ground up, utilizing forced labor and displacement to enforce racial hierarchies and subsidize their military expansion. Today, international law remains fractured over how to govern intimate labor. The debate hinges on an ideological schism. Neo-abolitionists view all sex work as inherent patriarchal violence, while labor advocates view it as a legitimate profession requiring worker protections. This diagram outlines the four major legislative models in use today. In the full criminalization model, utilized heavily in the US and South Africa, all aspects of the trade are prohibited. This forces the industry underground, dramatically increasing the risk of robbery and violence for marginalized workers. Next is the neo-abolitionist approach, commonly called the Nordic model. It attempts to eradicate demand by criminalizing the buyer. In practice, because clients fear arrest, workers are forced into isolated, clandestine locations to protect them, severely reducing the workers' physical safety. The third model is legalization, found in places like Germany and the Netherlands.
Here, sex work is legal, but gated by strict state licensing, heavy taxation, and rigid zoning. This creates a two-tiered system. High bureaucratic hurdles push immigrant and impoverished workers into an illegal, unregulated exterior market, cutting them off from police protection. Finally, the full decriminalization model, enacted in New Zealand. This removes all criminal penalties for consensual adult sex work. The industry is managed under standard labor, occupational health, and business laws, allowing workers to report violence without fear of arrest. Despite varying ideological intentions, the data demonstrates a clear pattern. Any legal model that relies on criminalization, whether targeting the buyer, the seller, or the location, acts to legally codify the isolation and physical danger of the worker. The impact of these legal frameworks extends far beyond courtroom theory. Punitive laws regarding sex work are recognized as a severe structural determinant driving the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. Under full criminalization, or the Nordic model, workers have to rush negotiations to avoid police detection. This eliminates the time needed to screen clients for violent behavior. Furthermore, because law enforcement frequently uses carrying condoms as evidence of prostitution, workers are pressured to operate without them. This chart shows mathematical modeling from UNAIDS and the World Health Organization. It projects the epidemiological impact of shifting from punitive laws to full decriminalization. Over a 10-year period, removing the threat of arrest and allowing safe operation leads to a 46% reduction in new HIV infections among sex workers. There is a vital secondary benefit. When sex work is decriminalized, workers gain enforceable labor rights and police protection, which drastically reduces sexual violence. Eliminating that physical violence averts an estimated additional 20% of global HIV infections. The criminalization of intimate labor carries an objective, fatal cost. The global scientific community now recognizes the removal of punitive laws as the most effective structural intervention to mitigate the HIV pandemic. As the physical streets grew increasingly dangerous, the internet initially provided a vital safety net. By moving transactions online, workers could shield themselves from immediate physical violence, verify client identities, and establish strict boundaries before ever meeting in person. That vital digital infrastructure was abruptly dismantled in 2018 when the United States Congress passed the legislation known as FOSTA SESTA. Ostensibly aimed at combating human trafficking, this legislation stripped away Section 230 protections, holding internet service providers legally liable if their platforms were used to facilitate sex work. The collateral damage to consensual workers was immediate. To avoid liability, massive web platforms enacted blanket censorship. They entirely deleted the digital screening hubs, identity verification networks, and bad date warning lists that workers relied on to stay alive. By destroying this digital safety net, the legislation stripped vulnerable individuals of their agency, pushing them directly back into hazardous physical environments and into the reliance of exploitative third-party pimps. Following this censorship, subscription platforms like OnlyFans stepped into the void. They marketed themselves as tools of emancipation, claiming to grant creators bodily autonomy by cutting out the physical middlemen entirely. This distribution curve shows the actual economic reality of platformized intimate labor. Workers operate under the hyper-precarious conditions of the gig economy. They lack employment benefits, healthcare, and algorithmic transparency. Revenue is aggressively skewed, with the top 1% of creators capturing over 33% of the capital, leaving the vast majority earning only roughly $150 a month. Adding to this precarity is digital gentrification. An influx of wealthy mainstream celebrities onto the platform heavily skews the algorithm, actively pushing marginalized traditional sex workers out of the market. Technological platforms replace traditional physical exploitation with algorithmic corporate exploitation, leaving the fundamental vulnerabilities of the laborer intact. Throughout history, we see the exact same tension repeating. The state relies heavily on the economic and social utility of prostitution, while systemically, legally, and often violently marginalizing the laborers who perform it. Roman sumptuary laws, British military cantonments, and Silicon Valley algorithmic censorship function as successive iterations of the same biopolitical control mechanism. Our contemporary legal frameworks remain fundamentally rooted in 19th century moral panics and imperial anxieties, rather than empirical modern data. International law is slowly adjusting. Modern frameworks like the Palermo Protocol reflect a shift toward defining human trafficking by the presence of coercion, fraud, and forced exploitation, finally creating a legal distinction between victims of abuse and consenting adults engaged in intimate labor. The historical and epidemiological evidence is conclusive. Punitive laws, regardless of their ideological intent, actively amplify physical violence, disease transmission, and corporate exploitation. The historical and epidemiological data frames full decriminalization and labor rights as a demonstrable, urgent necessity for global public health and human rights.